titled ROI. And I'm going to share my deck here for just a moment to give you some visuals and some best practices to follow along with as I illustrate some of these lessons I've learned from them. So my definition of ROI presented here is a little bit different than the traditional definition. While return on investment definitely still applies in this model, this is a framework that I actually use in my book that's coming out in a couple months with HarperCollins called Bet on Yourself. And the framework around which I built the book is this personal definition of ROI, where you recognize, own, and implement breakthrough career strategies to really create a unique path for yourself. And I know all of you as entrepreneurs need this more than ever. I can relate. After 12 years at Google, became my own startup founder 2.5 years ago, not anticipating the pandemic around the corner. So these are some of the best practices that I've adopted from my celebrity CEOs for us normal people as we're starting our companies. And because I know that the best practices of Jeff Bezos and Eric Schmidt maybe feel a little bit unattainable for most of us. They're actually very much within reach. So I've used my career as a template here to show you how we can use the best practices of these super performers in our daily lives as well. So for me, my journey in tech actually started very unintentionally. My parents moved to Seattle in 1985 after they were both raised on farms in Idaho. And my dad decided that farming was not the career for him, so he joined the military. And I was born in Florida and my next 3 sisters in Alaska. And after the military, he decided to become a lawyer, and he got a job in the big city of Seattle. I don't know if any of you have been to Seattle, but it's actually not that big. But to them, it was very, very different from the small farms that they'd grown up on. And that decision changed the course of my life. So moving to Redmond in 1985, they did not anticipate that the personal computing revolution was happening literally within 5-minute drive from our home. Microsoft headquarters is literally just down the hill from the house that my parents still live in today. And so I grew up with a lot of people in this technology focused community in the early 90s, late 90s, and then I watched the dot-com bust. So that was a time that was really important in Seattle because it was a very tech-heavy focused city, and the dot-com bust destroyed the local economy. I was graduating from undergrad in 2002, just a year or so after the original dot-com bust. And it was a crazy environment that I did not see coming. So I really feel for those who are just finishing university or starting companies right now, because I've been through the cycle a few times. So that dot-com bust right before I joined Amazon in the early 2000s. Then I moved to Google. And I was there for the 2008 economic crisis. And then now as a startup founder myself in the pandemic. But there are some tips and tricks that we can get through all of this together. And so that's what I'm going to outline for you today. So first, let's define a couple of these terms. So the R in our ROI is for recognize. And recognize for me is really about defining success for yourself. Who are you going to serve? Who do you want to be on this journey with? What are you going to put into the world and how are you going to implement it? Then the O is really about owning it. This is about reinventing and reinvesting in yourself as you go along your career journey, especially as entrepreneurs. And then implement is really about the pivots, the work, the pivot, repeat cycle that we all go through. So let me illustrate this through a couple of different stories. Now, this is Roger Bannister. If we have any Brits in the audience, you might know him. He's a living legend because he was the first person to run the mile in less than 4 minutes. Until Roger Bannister pulled this off, we thought it was physically impossible for a human to run the mile that fast. But he did so, and then just a few weeks later, he and another teammate broke it again, and now more than 1,700 sprinters have now broken this record. In fact, it's considered now standard for elite athletes. So what was once considered literally physically impossible is standard for elite athletes. And I think that really shows us that a lot of what holds us back can just be mental barriers. Just because no one we know has done it before, or anyone who looks like me, or anyone in my circle who's been to my schools or from my family or my cultural expectations has done it, sometimes we can hold ourselves back. And what I think is most impressive, I hope after my talk, you'll go in here and you will Google and watch Roger Bannister run this. They call it the Miracle Mile, the 4-minute mile, because the most important element of this was the pacers. So he had 2 teammates that helped him beat this record. And as you watch them go, obviously the video is only 4 minutes long, so it's not a big commitment. But as you watch them do the first 2 laps, Roger has a teammate in front of him, pacing him for that relentless pace he needs to stay on in order to beat the record. But then after 2 laps, that teammate is completely spent and burnt out and peels off. Then another teammate who was behind Roger this entire time pulls to the front and paces him for that grueling 3rd lap. But then that pacer has to pull off because he can't go any farther. And that's when Roger accomplishes the Miracle Mile. And I think that's really analogous for what it feels like to be startup founders right now. You hopefully are hiring some people who really push you to be your best. And maybe for those first 2 laps, they are far better than you. And maybe there's someone who can really pull ahead and do that 3rd mile, but it is on you to complete this Miracle Mile. So I want you to think of that analogy as we go through the different principles of ROI. So recognizing, owning, and implementing your vision is something that we do over and over again. But I think we don't spend quite enough time on the who. So for recognize, there's several elements of this I think are really important for us startup founders. And one is the mission and vision of the plan, talking about your dream experiences, what you want to accomplish, and then setting goals so high for yourself that you'll be disappointed having not tried them more than any potential failure. So while all of you have probably spent a lot of time on your business plan, I hope that you will take Jessica's advice, who just spoke right before me, and spend a lot of time thinking about who is at your side. Not only what are you putting into the world and how are you going to get it out there and who you're serving, but who you want to do it with. Because in my experience, that's the biggest indicator of future success. I've seen so many really good ideas not gain the traction because they didn't have the right people in the right seats. And vice versa. I've seen some mediocre ideas really take the industry by storm when they have the right teammates who pace them, who keep that relentless pace and encourage you that you can do something that no one's ever done before. And I hope you'll hire people who have sketched out what I call in my book a dream resume. This has nothing to do with titles or seniority. It actually only has to do with the milestones of things you want to have learned, people you want to have experienced it with, and the networks that you're building. And so I hope as you're attracting this top talent who's keeping you on this grueling pace, that you're allowing them to think outside of traditional job descriptions and to create experiences for learning. I'm a big believer that your job should give as much to you as you give to it. And in any startup, that's a really high bar. So I hope you'll take some time today, as you've been inspired by a lot of these speakers and maybe some ideas of things you want to implement pop up into your head. Go back and look at the mission statement that you probably sketched out on day 1 when this was really crystallizing as an idea for you. And revisit your core values first. These are the things that likely will not change for you over time. This is really about who your work is for and what your legacy is that you're building every day. Now, after my 12 years at Google, I now consult with startup CEOs all over the world, literally on 5 different continents of completely different industries and different growth stages. And the core values are really, really important to them. But what sometimes doesn't translate, and often is when they come to me for consulting services, things start to break because as you scale up, some of the systems that could work when your team was really small and all in one room together start to break. And that's when you really need to look at your mission statement and see, do you have something that's effective? And a good way to test this is if someone, a new hire in your company who's never met you, was given your mission statements, your value propositions, your leadership principles, and with just that, could they make decisions on your behalf? If the answer is no, your mission statement actually isn't converting into decision-making and pointing you again at your North Star. As we know, the original mariners, when they were sailing the oceans, looked to this North Star because it never moved. And you need to define this for your team of what it is. My first 3 years after university, I sat next to Jeff Bezos. In fact, the closest desk in the entire company, next to him from the years of 2002 to 2005. when we definitely needed a North Star because success was absolutely not guaranteed. In fact, there were many days it looked like we weren't going to survive. And it was really important for all the leaders as we were growing at scale to be united around a single North Star. And originally, I was there during the years when they wrote, the senior executives at Amazon wrote the original leadership principles. There's now 14, but at the time I was there were 10. And that was something that to this day, you can quiz me on. I think I have them all memorized, not because anyone made me do it, but because it was such a regular part of our conversations as we were making decisions that it was part of the vernacular. It's the way that we debated things and we were talking about what we actually wanted to get done. And this is the way that you can take some really big risks. If something is tied to your core values and your leadership principles, then even if it doesn't work out in the way you imagine, you're not going to regret that. And I really learned it's impossible to distill what I learned from Jeff Bezos over 3 years in those foundational years of the internet. But two things I want to point out to you now. One is the people he surrounded himself with. And second is his, what he calls a regret minimization principle. So I'm going to start with the latter. So you might have heard this quote before, from Jeff, but this is really about when he was a very successful hedge fund manager at D.E. Shaw. And he was paid very well. He was very well respected. He was the third VP in the company's history, the youngest to become so. He was comfortable. He was successful. There was no reason to leave. But he had this idea for this thing called the internet. And he had this conversation with himself, as you've seen the quote here, that he imagined himself at the end of his life looking back. He knew that he would regret more not having tried this crazy thing called the internet. He would regret more not having tried and failed than he would if he hadn't tried at all. He didn't mind the thought of having failed, but he couldn't stand the thought of not having taken a risk on himself. And so with that, he left this very comfortable New York life of his, all this success and accolades and wealth and compensation that he had, and moved to the other side of the country, not knowing anyone, and started Amazon in his garage. And this is where it became really apparent that he needed to have the highest possible quality talent around him. And when I first started working for Jeff, he had just started for the very first time the role called the Shadow. And now, 17 years later, it has a more formal title called Technical Director. But at the time, it was officially titled The Shadow. And the Shadow of year one in 2002 was Andy Jassy. Now, that name might have come across your desk a couple of times recently because 17 years later, he has been deemed the successor of Jeff Bezos to become the next CEO of Amazon. But first, he was the Shadow. Now, the job of the Shadow was that he was going to join every meeting that Jeff was in. He was going to be at his side, copied on every email, listening to every phone call, all the things, so that he could do a couple of things. One, he could push back on Jeff's ideas. He could be that critical eye, that intellectual sparring partner that he needed to make sure that he was seeing around blind corners and being really thoughtful about the decisions they were making. And two, Jeff was training his young executives to think like he did, to ask the questions he would ask, like what he likes, hate what he hates, and really be guided by those same leadership principles. At the end of that year and a half, Andy Jassy went on to lead the multi-billion-dollar subsidiary company, Amazon Web Services, and then now is the successor for Amazon.com. So I watched that and I thought, okay, I was only 20 years old, but I was sitting next to Jeff and it really changed the way I thought about my work. Instead of considering myself the junior most person in the company who had no idea what I was doing, which both of those were true, I decided to consider it my own personal apprenticeship and to treat myself like the Shadow and really use it as a time to craft my own personal business school following Jeff Bezos. But after 3 years, I went back to my plan A, which was to become an academic. And I moved to California to really invest in myself. And I thought I was owning it. I thought that this was me really being committed to what I thought was my calling, which was to really study the academics. So I graduated undergrad in 2002. That was the year the euro was launched, if you remember that. And so it felt like something really exciting was happening in the global economy. And I was really interested in global business. But about a year or so into my PhD program at Berkeley in California, Google started calling. And I really felt like now was the time to take my own version of that big risk and to follow Jeff's example and try this crazy thing called Google. And I always figured academics would be there if this Google thing didn't work out. And I never would have imagined when I joined that I would be there for 12 years. But I learned a lot. And I think it was because I was able to consistently up level my efforts rather than staying stagnant. In Google years, I mean, 12 years at a company is like I'm 1,000 years old now. But the reason why I could do that is because I was reinventing my role just about every 3 years. I was doing something very different than I had in the previous 3 years. The first 3 years I worked for Marissa Meyer. She was the VP over search products, which meant we just made really cool stuff. Other people figured out how to monetize it, but we were running really, really fast. And we had to consistently set new expectations for ourselves. We were always in a sprint cycle. I was always in a war room. But I found that really thrilling because we were taking big risks and inventing things that had never existed before. And one great example I learned from Marissa is you have to become comfortable being constantly uncomfortable. In fact, Larry, in our IPO letter, when he launched Google, he said, he wanted to remain uncomfortably excited about what we were working on. And that is the core of the Google DNA in my experience. So one example of this was a particularly stressful launch cycle we were going through. I think it was 2007. They had launched something called iGoogle before I joined, I think in 2003, but it hadn't really caught on. It was the original concept of this is way before we had smartphones. There were no apps. So we thought, why not? We wanted to make Google people's default homepage, because at the time that was not true. Yahoo was the dominant search engine at the time. And so we thought, what could make them come here as their first stop when they turn on their computer every day? And so we wanted to customize the homepage where you could have these widgets to check the weather and check your text messages and check your email and have everything easily accessible there. So we spent a lot of time on this. It didn't gain traction. We were still teaching people how to use the internet. And then Marissa had a great idea to pair with some of her favorite designers. So we did customizable homepages with Oscar de la Renta and Diane von Furstenberg, Mark Echo, even Coldplay did a customizable homepage. What we didn't know, though, when we sat in, we did the launch in New York in the meatpacking district of Manhattan. And I'll never forget, like the stage was outside under the night stars. It was a really warm night. And we projected these beautiful images onto the old brick buildings of New York. And the juxtaposition of old and new was so beautiful. And we'd worked so hard for this. But what we didn't know at the time was just a few months later, Apple would launch their app store. And soon we would have smartphones, and it disrupted everything. And just a few months later, we would start what now is Google Play. So you have to be willing to kill your darlings, own it, pivot early and often, and stay in that uncomfortable zone, be uncomfortably excited about what you're working on. And the final element of our ROI is implement. This is what I call how you engineer serendipity. So to engineer luck, sometimes you might look around at your peers and be like, God, that guy's so lucky, or wow, how did she pull that off? I think this actually comes down to knowing exactly what you're looking for. So that's the team members that you need to be hiring for, the talent, whatever it might be, this element. If you've identified that in a very clear mission statement and your value statement, then when these opportunities or talent or candidates or stages come your way in their infancy, you're going to recognize that as the small granular of what you need to be really successful. And this is how you can jump on that when otherwise it might have passed you by and it's passing your peers by. This is about being very present in how you're putting things together and building your team. As I mentioned, the last 9.5 years I worked at Google, it was for Eric Schmidt. The first 3 years of that, he was still CEO, and then as executive chairman. I learned so much in that decade that we worked together. I was going to say I should write a book. I did write a book about it, but I want to share just one anecdote with you that I think about all the time. So literally on Eric Schmidt's desk, he has a plaque, and it says, if at all possible, say yes. And for a long time, I wasn't sure what that plaque meant. And then by watching his behavior, I figured it out. It wasn't about saying yes to everything or putting too much on your plate or not delegating or being a micromanager. It was kind of the opposite intention. When possible, say yes means remain insatiably curious. Say yes to things that might feel very disconnected from your day-to-day or your core goals. In fact, people often ask me, what are the common denominators between these three very influential CEOs I work for? And the number one thing I say is insatiable curiosity. They read voraciously, they travel, expanding your circle of influence, whether that's by what you read, what your network is like, your friends. This is really about creating opportunities for yourself that if you stayed in your comfort zone and your usual bubble would never come your way. In fact, Eric was when he realized that he was going to be as a CEO on an airplane every single day, he decided that he wanted to do the fun part, which is fly it. So he started doing as a hobby what people do as a living, and he became a certified jet pilot on more than 5 aircraft. And then later in 2 levels of helicopters, which is actually the opposite instincts for you pilots out there. So he really modeled this to the fullest in a way that continues to inspire me. Now, none of this should be interpreted as hero worship. These companies and people are not perfect, but there's definitely best practices that we as startup founders can implement today, regardless of our scale or industry, that will give you a bit of an edge and help you make some big wins. So I want to leave you with this thought. There are 7 billion people in the world. So if you're trying something right now that you feel like has just a 1 in a million chance of working, that's actually 7,000 people out there who will get that chance, who will win that. So why not you? I really hope that this brings to mind some things that you want to focus on, whether it's talent or revisiting your mission statement or putting together your leadership principles so that every layer of your company is making decisions when you're not in the room. And I hope that you'll continue this conversation with me. I'd love to hear the stages you're at, the questions you have. I have some free resources here on my website. I actually have a workbook to go through some of the things that I've just touched on ever so briefly here. And my podcast and my book, both titled Bet on Yourself, really touch on these elements.